In recent years, Poland has embarked on an ambitious journey to increase its military capabilities in order to deter Russian aggression. Poland, in fact, is on track to become Europe's largest land power. In this video, I want to talk about Poland's efforts to enhance its military capabilities and also what this means for European defense. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. I'm going to do this video in two parts. In the first part, I want to provide an overview of what the Poles have been up to. In the second, I want to try to bring the discussion up to a more strategic level and talk about what this means for European defense. So what are the Poles doing? Now, to be clear, the Poles have actually have been at this for a while, at least since the 2016 Strategic Defense Review and the associated defense concept document, which was released in 2017. What these documents do is they really formally put an end to the drift that Poland has been guilty of, and frankly every other NATO country since the end of the Cold War, with respect to their understanding of the point of having a military and what their defense priorities need to be. Poland, like many other European countries through the 2000s, had this notion that perhaps that European war was really a thing of the past. There was a very marginal risk of that. And what they really needed to be worried about were expeditionary capabilities in engaging in operations such as Afghanistan. And yes, Poland did contribute to the war in Afghanistan. Polish soldiers did fight. 2016 marks an end to all of that. The idea is basically for the Polish military to go back to basics. The threat, it turns out, is in Europe. The threat is Russia. Never mind expeditionary capabilities. What Poland needs is a military that can deter, using conventional power, Russian aggression. Now, remember my criticism of the United Kingdom. The criticism is really more of a kind of an observation that the United Kingdom suffered from indecision about what kind of global power it was supposed to be, it should be, and what kind of military it needed to build, and should they focus on the continental defense or on global force projection or whatnot. And as a result of this indecision, there was a lot of inefficiency with regard to weapons procurement and funding and whatnot. This is all very understandable. I mean, the United Kingdom is ultimately, it's an island nation at a fairly safe distance from most of the world's conflicts. And therefore, it kind of has a luxury to think about, well, what do they want to do and what kind of military do they need? Poland doesn't have that kind of luxury. Poland shares land borders with Russia and with Belarus, which is a Russian satellite. That really just changes everything, and it adds an incredible amount of clarity to this strategic situation. The Poles, of course, understand this, and the Poles understand what kind of military that they need to have. So what have the Poles been doing? Well, the first thing that needs to be said is that the Poles have dramatically increased their defense spending over the last 20 years. It's good now. I believe in 2024 it has already reached 4% of GDP. So I believe that the Poles are the big spenders amongst NATO powers. You can see the growth in the defense spending in these two charts. The first chart shows Polish defense spending in absolute terms. I believe these are US dollars, so billions of US dollars. And in the second chart, what we see here is the growth in Polish defense spending as a proportion of the Polish GDP. Both charts tell the same story, which is that the Poles are spending big on defense, and they're really very serious. This substantial investment in financing is going towards military expansion and towards a very broad-ranging modernization program. In terms of expanding Poland's military, the Polish government intends to more than double the size of its land forces to 300,000 people. This would make Poland the largest military or the largest army in at least all of the European parts of NATO. I need to look up how many soldiers the Turks have. I mean, they have a very large military, but certainly compared to the European NATO allies, that this is a gigantic number. This also includes the creation of new divisions and also the expansion of Poland's territorial defense forces. These are some of the current numbers from 2023. I believe Poland has about 292,000 active duty personnel. They are divided into 5 services. We have the Army, which has or had 100,000 soldiers and a reserve of 40,000. The Air Force has about 46,500. The Navy, 17,000. The Special Forces has 4,000 Special Forces, and then 55,000 members of the Territorial Defense Forces. Now, a few words about the Territorial Defense Forces, because I actually think this is very important. Territorial defense forces are local defenses. They're organized by province, and they are designed to be autonomous within their home areas and to draw the personnel from local people. And their structure is considered to be particularly effective for dealing with countering hybrid warfare. We're talking about like little green men and sabotage and defending rare areas, etc. They have certain specific tasks. These include coordinating defensive activities with the conventional operational forces, of course, but then also carrying out unconventional activities, which can include sabotage and anti-sabotage, reconnaissance, etc. I believe that this extends to what one refers to as left-behind operations. The idea is that as the Polish army itself withdraws in the face of the onslaught of invading Russian forces, territorial forces will stay behind in areas that the Russians are now occupying and cause all sorts of havoc. I wish to add that the Poles have acquired and are acquiring thousands and thousands of anti-tank rockets. We're talking Spikes, we're talking Carl Gustavs, etc. And I can imagine that many of these things are now in the hands of territorial forces. The idea being that while the Russians have maybe taken over an area, you've got these territorial force guys are operating in little cells, and they're popping up and firing their Carl Gustavs at anything that they can blow up. In addition, the Poles are acquiring very advanced weaponry. Poland is on a shopping spree. So among the things Poland is buying, the numbers are really very impressive. 366 Abrams tanks from the United States, plus Poland is on contract to buy 180 Korean K2 tanks, with talk of another order of 180 more K2 tanks. Both the Polish Abrams and the K2s are supposed to be, from what I've read, are going to have the Israeli trophy system integrated into them. Trophy is a very powerful technology. It's an active defense, active protection system. And what it does is it's like missile defense, but scaled down to a tank. So if you fire an anti-tank missile at a vehicle that's got Trophy on it, Trophy will detect it and will fire an interceptor munition that will intercept the missile and explode it before it actually strikes the tank. The Israelis have found that this is actually very useful, and most of the modern militaries now are trying to integrate either a derivative of the Israeli Trophy thing. That's what the Americans are doing. So Americans are buying Trophy, or they're racing to develop their own thing, which is what the French are doing. In addition to all that, Poland is also buying more Leopard 2 tanks. They're going to have a total of 247 Leopard 2s, different variants, by 2026. Poland also had a large number of upgraded T-72s, but from what I've read, they've given them all to Ukraine, which is excellent. In addition, Poland is buying 1,400 Borsuk tracked infantry fighting vehicles, 700 what they call CBWP heavy infantry fighting vehicles. These things are also tracked, both of which are like loaded with Spikes and all the latest electronic gear, and at least 232 upgraded Rosamac wheeled infantry fighting vehicles. The Poles are also buying 96 Apache attack helicopters from Boeing. I'm on the fence about whether or not that matters, because it's not clear to me how useful attack helicopters are on the modern battlefield or in any place where there's a large number of things like manpads and other air defense systems. I'm under the impression from watching the Ukraine war that Russia's large number of attack helicopters have largely been blunted, right? That as a force, it's not that useful because they've lost a lot to Ukrainian air defenses. But of course, it's just an impression. Maybe for all I know, in many cases, the Russian attack helicopters are being used to devastating effect. It's really hard to tell. But I think that the real big deal in terms of Poland's military investment, its huge investment, is with long-range fires. Long-range fires is something that people have been saying now for years that this is going to be important, but the Ukraine war has definitely validated this. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to strike the enemy behind the lines, ideally doing things like hitting their command centers, hitting their logistical hubs, hitting their ammunitions depots, key infrastructure, maybe it's a bridge, being able to do it from a distance. So what is Poland doing? Poland has contracted to purchase 364 Korean K9 self-propelled howitzers. These numbers, by the way, dwarf the numbers of self-propelled howitzers that Western European armies have. With their Caesars and the PZH-2000s and the AS-90s and the like. All those are really excellent weapon systems, but they're just really very few of them. I mean, the France has what, like 77 now or 60 something Caesars. They're going to build a few more, but very, very small numbers compared to what the Poles have. Poles are also contracted to buy 150 of its own Crab self-propelled howitzers. As far as I know, the K9s and the Crabs are more or less the same in terms of their capabilities. They're both modern. They're both state-of-the-art. They're both very highly effective. The other big purchase that the Poles are making are HIMARS. These are long-range precision rockets. So they are buying from Lockheed Martin, from the United States, 500 HIMARS rocket launchers, and they're buying 288 Korean HIMARS. These numbers, by the way, 500 HIMARS and 288 Korean systems, these numbers are far greater than anything that the Western European militaries have. I mean, it dwarfs the kinds of things that the French have, the British have, the Italians have, the Germans have, etc. This is huge. The Ukraine war has really validated the value of these things, and the Poles are leaning heavily into this purchase. The Poles also have been buying Patriot air defense systems. They are buying 48 F-35 fighters. They're also modernizing the 48 F-16s that they already have. And they purchased 48 Korean-made Fa-50 light attack jets. I don't really know how good they are, but they're very modern. They're something, and all of this is better than older Russian Soviet-era kit that the Poles probably had sitting around on their airfields. Poles also have launched an ambitious border fortification project. They're calling it East Shield. They are spending reportedly $2.5 billion on this, and they're putting it on the borders with Russia, the Kaliningrad enclave, and then with Belarus. And in October of 2024, the Polish government announced that construction will begin by the end of, so quote, by the end of this year, unquote, meaning already in 2024. What are we talking about? We're talking about a mix of old school physical barriers, fortifications, bunkers, anti-tank ditches, those like famous like cement dragon's teeth emplacements, with high-tech sensors, early warning sensors, masts with electronic sensors and cameras and whatnot, and aerostats. People might easily dismiss physical barriers and fortifications, but I think that's a mistake. I mean, people think about the Maginot Line and think, well, that didn't work out. Well, in a way, the Maginot Line worked because it forced the Germans to go a different direction. And the French mistake was in counting too much on the Maginot Line and thinking that, with the Maginot Line that they would be safe. That was false. But the Maginot Line, in a way, actually worked. Now, perhaps a better comparison would be the Israeli Bar-Lev line on the Suez Canal in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and then Israeli defenses on the Golan Heights. Yes, the Egyptians and the Syrians were able to penetrate these defensive lines, but the critical thing is that in the process, they took serious casualties. So the defensive lines caused a significant amount of attrition on the part of the Egyptians and the Syrian forces. And perhaps just as importantly, the need to fight their way through these defensive lines bought the Israelis time, and time is precious in the case of a massive attack. The Poles are also pushing NATO cooperation. They're trying to deepen their integration with NATO. They're doing this by hosting multinational battle groups and focusing on interoperability, above all with the United States. There are now, speaking of the Americans, there are now about 10,000 U.S. soldiers in Poland, and the American footprint is expected to grow. This is of huge importance for Poland. It's a way to guarantee that anybody who gets into a fight with Poland is probably also going to get into a fight with the United States. The Poles, I believe, I have no doubt really, have not forgotten the lessons of 1939, the lessons of 1939 being that British and French security guarantees in the absence of British and French troops on the ground ultimately meant nothing. And so they were left undefended or without any kind of assistance from the Allies when the Germans and the Soviets invaded. Poles, I think, are trying to be careful about avoiding that, and they're doing that by making sure that foreign powers, their security partners, already have boots on the ground, and that those boots in the ground are going to be dragged into any kind of fight that breaks out. Another thing that the Poles are doing is they're trying to boost their industrial capacity. They are investing in their defense industrial base. They're planning, for instance, to do local production of HIMARS ammunition. They're doing everything they can to integrate into all the new systems they're purchasing stuff that's made in Poland. So, for instance, they are making Lockheed Martin integrate their HIMARS into Polish truck chassis. They're also trying to domestically produce the Korean K2 tanks. I've read that they're also interested in trying to create domestic production of Abrams M1 tanks. And basically, as much as they can, they're going to build their own stuff. And it's not unforeseeable, it's not impossible that in the future, other European countries are going to be buying Polish weapons and weapon systems. Lastly, I want to add that the Poles are taking cybersecurity and resilience very seriously. They've been watching what the Russians have been doing with their little green men, etc., and cyber warfare, and they are pushing a total defense concept that's supposed to involve the entire nation in building resilience against potential hybrid threats. Whether doing this effectively, I don't know, but at least on paper, this is what they're trying to do. All this adds up to a lot of kit, a lot of soldiers, a lot of weapons. What does Poland intend to do with all of this stuff? The answer appears to be that the Poles are thinking about defense in depth rather than some sort of offensive campaign in the enemy's territory. So the Poles are not embracing, let's say, the Israeli doctrine, which is all about trying to fight the fight on the enemy's soil. Of course, the Israelis do this because they have absolutely no strategic depth. Israel's a tiny, tiny little sliver of a piece of land hard up against the coast. So you can't afford to have a defensive battle. Poland, by virtue of being a large country, certainly relative to Israel, has something of strategic depth. And above all, what they want to do is they want to buy as much time as possible so that NATO, Poland's NATO allies, can get their acts together and can come to Poland's help. So this all makes sense, particularly with the Eastern Front, the East Front, the defensive works, the territorial defenses. I think it could all really work such that anyone can invade Poland and maybe prevail, but it's going to be a hard slog and it's going to be a bloody slog. And it's going to take much longer than probably any invader would really want an invasion to take. So can this all work? I mean, who knows? I think it can. I think it could totally work. I think this combination of HIMARS in particular, plus the territorial defenses, could really make for a bloody fight, which is really all the Poles can hope to achieve. And in terms of achieving deterrence, it's easy to imagine that this could work, that if you're the Russians and you've seen how badly you were doing in Ukraine, you might think twice about trying to take on Poland in any kind of direct confrontation. One thing that this means is that the likelihood of any kind of direct invasion of Poland, I think, is much reduced because of this capability. But this doesn't rule out the idea of gray zone operations or any sort of hybrid thing. And the Poles are well aware of this. And this is where I think the territorial defenses might actually play a critical role, and perhaps a role as important as all the fancy new HIMARS and all that kind of thing, just in terms of deterring hybrid threats and making clear that that kind of stuff won't work, because you're going to have these guys running around the woods and running around Polish towns with Carl Gustavs and spikes who are capable of wreaking terrible havoc behind the lines. I think that really matters. It also matters in rear areas if there's going to be saboteurs or all sorts of, hybrid, soft, Russian special forces guys running around. The territorial forces, I think, are going to be really good and very useful for dealing with that kind of threat. So let's get to part two. What does this all mean? Poland's rise as a major land power means that arguably the shift in balance is going to go towards the center. The shift for European defense, rather, is going to move east towards Poland, away from the big three of Britain, France, and Germany. It's Poland and not Britain, France, and Germany that are going to have the means to actually fight a major war. And certainly perhaps they're the only ones that could actually fight a major war alone without significant help from others. And also, Poland is investing so much in their military defense that it's plausible that Polish defense industry is going to play a big role in the future for European defense writ large. European defense capacity is really very low. Proof is the fact that Poland is turning to Korea to buy new tanks and new self-propelled howitzers. I rather doubt the Poles would be doing that if they thought that they're European vendors that can meet their requirements, but they can. So the Poles are turning to the Koreans. In the meantime, Poles are trying to create an industry so that they themselves can make as much stuff as they possibly can. All of this is good. The more industrial capacity in Europe, the better. It alleviates the demand, the wait list, if you will. If you're trying to buy a Leopard 2, you're trying to buy something made by the French or the British or the Germans. The Poles are just adding to the options. And it's also not entirely, as I already said, it's not implausible that people in the future are going to be buying Polish weapon systems, Polish armored vehicles, Polish HIMARS, etc. I would also argue that Poland, with a large military, with a large army, would probably be more effective than any coalition force that NATO can cobble together. I'm saying this because I feel like that by definition, a national force, right, 100,000 soldiers that all belong to the same army are going to be more effective than a coalition of different units that are cobbled together that might be the same size, just in terms of the integration, coordination, etc. That, all things being equal, it's going to fight better. The other thing is that the Poles are bringing to the fight capabilities that are organic to the Polish army, but are really not organic anymore for many European armies. So many European armies today assume that they're going to be able to borrow capabilities from other people, like HIMARS and long-range fires, etc. So in a coalition, you've got, the British, French, the Italians, and everybody else are going to be borrowing capabilities from one another or from the United States. And you got to wonder if that means that there's going to be enough of these capabilities to go around. I mean, if everybody shows up, comes to the party, assuming that everybody else is going to be bringing the main dish, and they're just going to focus on desserts, are you going to have any main dishes? Right? Or if you go to a party and you just assume that everybody else is bringing food, but you're not going to bring food because you're going to eat somebody else's food, maybe there's just not going to be enough food to go around. So the same is going to be true for logistics support and artillery and all these kinds of things. The Poles are having an organic, what the Europeans are hoping to borrow from somebody else. Perhaps the bottom line is that the future of European defense, particularly if the United States fails under the administration of a certain Donald Trump, that it's going to be Polish, right? That Poland, or Warsaw, is really going to be where things matter, much more so than Berlin or London or Paris. And I think that the UK and the French and the Americans really need to take note and to understand this, that if there's a serious war that breaks out, increasingly it's the Polish land forces that you really need. And Poland is the country that you need to be dealing with. Of course, Britain and France still have nuclear weapons, which is all well and good if that matters. And if there's a real threat of the use of nuclear weapons, so that can help deter it. But if you're in a situation where, for whatever reason, people aren't availing themselves of nuclear weapons or taking seriously the threat of nuclear weapons, meaning the conflict will remain largely conventional, it's Poland that's going to have what it takes. The UK and France just don't have the numbers, even if they've got the quality and the capabilities. And the Germans just seem to be out to lunch. Now, with Poland at the center of the alliance's eastern flank, right? The center, is it really the eastern flank? I mean, it's more like the central front. But if the Poles are really right there smack in the middle, I think that the chance of a direct attack against its center is greatly diminished. The Russians are going to go around. Or perhaps even more likely, what the Russians are going to do is they're going to exploit every opportunity they can to divide NATO and to create unrest and to try to create the possibility, perhaps, of taking the so-called salami slices out of the West, or both wrote about the artichoke method. You just kind of peel off slices from the artichoke or leaves from the artichoke, and then present to NATO fait accompli. I think that the Poles are onto them, and they realize that this is a real threat. And I hope that this means that the Poles won't be overly passive, that they're not going to be on the defensive, meaning just sitting back and waiting for a crisis to force them to act. I think it's better to be more foreleaning and much more proactive. I think these are some of the lessons from the 1930s vis-a-vis the German threat, where the Western powers were really very passive and inertia bound, and were sort of waiting for Germany to do something that was so outrageous that they had no choice but to act, but at which point, to a large extent, it was already too late. If I'm right, and Poland really becomes, because of its growing hard power, really becomes a leader in European defense, there might be some important political consequences. Let's think of it this way. NATO members have different takes on the nature of the Russian threat and what to do about it. Let's think of it as a spectrum. Now, on one end of the spectrum, you've got Poland and the 3 Baltic states, and those guys are really sort of hot and bothered about Russia and take a hard line when it comes to Russia. At the other end of the spectrum, well, I guess the extreme would be Hungary, and possibly the United States, God forbid, under Donald Trump. Everybody else is really somewhere in the middle, right? I put together this graphic that just sort of demonstrates this possibility. The spread here is important because the distance between these countries represents a diplomatic opening and a potential for disunity and disunity and dissent and political and diplomatic fighting. If there's a crisis, and then with each crisis, these countries are going to react to these crises differently. I can see Poland and the Baltics wanting to take a hard line to every crisis. I could see other countries, including France and Britain and Germany, wishing to prevaricate to different extents, right? I think the French are going to take a harder line than the Germans, but the French aren't going to take as hard a line as the Poles or the Baltics. And anytime there's an issue, there's going to be this difference, which means that different countries within the NATO alliance are going to be wanting to pull the consensus in different directions. The Russians will be on to this. The Russians are going to do everything they can to exploit these differences and try to increase the daylight between these countries and to in effect, cripple NATO. Because, of course, NATO, in theory, is run by consensus. I mean, NATO really can't do anything unless there's a consensus. So this is a way to take apart the consensus and to weaken it and to therefore weaken the NATO alliance. If Donald Trump wins the election, and if he weakens the NATO alliance or decides to drop Ukraine and adopts a much more, what's a good way of saying it, supine position vis-a-vis Russia, then these differences amongst the European allies are going to become ever more vital and ever more important. And leadership within the European powers, among European powers, is going to be ever more critical. And there's going to be a problem wherein the Poles are going to want to assert some kind of leadership as befitting their relative military strength. France and London and Berlin, for different reasons, are going to want to assert their own leadership, but they might be pulling in different directions. Potentially, this could really spell trouble for NATO and for Europe. So it will remain to be seen. But maybe another way of putting it is that if isolation really were to become the approach du jour, like if Donald Trump were to lead the United States in a more isolationist position, then American leadership will play a reduced role. And then there will be, in a sense, a leadership vacuum in Europe that the Poles are going to try to fill, while the French and the Germans and the British are also going to try to fill. But they're going to have different ideas and want to take the consensus and lead the pack, as it were, potentially in very different directions. This is something that I think that Europeans should be really, really worried about moving ahead. And then also as an American who's very much concerned about the West and NATO defense and really worries about what future President Trump might actually do, this is something that concerns me very much. So what do you think about Poland's military transformation and also its prospects for leadership within European defense? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And also don't forget to like and subscribe. And stay tuned for more geopolitical and military analysis. And of course, please check out in the description, you're going to find my LinkedIn, my Twitter, as well as my website, michaelshirkin.com. Thank you very much.